Waynesboro, 200 years of history, is made possible through the financial support of the Citizens National Bank of Southern Pennsylvania.
The year was 1749. Freedom from Great Britain was still a generation away. West of the great city of Philadelphia, most of colonial Pennsylvania was still a vast, unspoiled wilderness, a place revered as a haven of religious tolerance. Scotsman John Wallace, in search of a new life in this new world, crossed into this beautiful valley with his family that year and went no further. He purchased 633 acres of land and called his new estate Mount Vernon. Soon others followed, and a small settlement began to rise at the nearby crossroads. And so the foundation was set for a new town. For 2 centuries, built by hand and heart, by farmers and merchants, inventors and factory workers, teachers, clergy and family. The town of Waynesboro. In the mid-1700s, the settlement became known as Wallacetown. Typical of our fledgling frontier colony, little else but a collection of homesteads. Life was hard, and at times hostile. The Renfrews, one of the earliest families here, nestled their home along a branch of Antietam Creek. As the legend goes, around 1764, daughters Sarah and Jane were busy washing clothes in the creek when they were brutally attacked, killed by 2 Indians.
2 vigilantes supposedly started after them and met up with them in Bedford, Pennsylvania, in the Bedford area. And they were supposedly eating wild plums. Each one of the vigilantes took one of the Indians and shot them and scalped them and brought their scalps back, and supposedly got back in time to bury those scalps with the 2 sisters.
The Renfrew Massacre was one of the last known Indian attacks in the area. About the same time, Wallacetown was caught in the middle of a border dispute between the commissioners of Penn and Baltimore. If Lord Baltimore had his way, Wallacetown would sit several miles within Maryland. In fact, some of Wallacetown's early settlers, like the Stoner family, carried land grants from both sides.
So we weren't sure where we were. We could have been in Maryland and we could have been in Pennsylvania. So the land documents are recorded, and you can find them in Frederick County in the first deed book over there, opening in 1748.
Well, 1763, they decided they got together and decided they should resolve this once and for all. And they did by hiring Mason and Dixon to draw the line. Now that sounds easy, but where do you start?
Beginning at the Delaware border, it took Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon 2 years to reach our area, laying the Mason-Dixon line just a few miles to the south of Wallacetown. Forevermore, Wallacetown, and eventually Waynesboro, would be part of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Soon the Revolutionary War began. Critical to the colonial government, Pennsylvanians, including many from Wallacetown, were quick to take up arms.
The colonial capital had been moved from Philadelphia to Lancaster and then to York. So the proximity to Waynesboro was not that great.
As a contribution to the war effort, Wallacetown blacksmith John Burns crafted what's believed to be the world's first wrought iron cannon. Taken to the Battle of Brandywine, it unfortunately fell into the hands of the British.
After its capture, it was reported that it was taken to the Tower of London and put in storage.
John Wallace's youngest son, also named John, joined the famous Pennsylvania line and worked his way up to lieutenant. His commanding officer was General Anthony Wayne, nicknamed Mad Anthony after a heroic attack at the Battle of Stony Point. As the legend goes, General Wayne passed through Wallacetown during the war and surveying the valley said, What a wonderful spot for a town. Young John Wallace took that to heart. With the Revolution won, little had changed in tiny Wallacestown. People were busy on their farms, isolated by the unending burdens of their chores. But around 1780, that all began to change.
John Burns, who was one of our great early citizens, thought we ought to have school. And then, I think with an afterthought, a church. So he had the cabin built. His iron furnaces made all the hinges for the doors.
The small one-room cabin perched on the hill was warmly embraced. At least 5 area churches active today can trace their start to these humble beginnings.
It was a place to center people in. So Burns really contributed a lot to taking away the fact that we all lived alone out here isolated, and brought them together.
By 1797, John Wallace, the patriarch of the Wallace family, had been gone nearly 2 decades. The titles of his vast landholdings passed down to his son, young John Wallace. As the businessman of the family, young John came up with a bold new plan to carve out part of the estate and create a formal town. 90 neat lots plotted over 91 acres along the main road from Greencastle to Baltimore. Wallace would call his new town Waynesboro in honor of Anthony Wayne. At its heart, a diamond or square where prime lots sold for £5, 5 shillings each.
By the way, they were done by lottery. You just reached in the bowl and pulled out a number. So you didn't know where you were getting. It's kind of interesting. And then there was some trading.
Henry Smith, a shoemaker, purchased the first lot, number 49. A fair number quickly followed, and by 1811, every lot had been sold but one. That year, John Wallace died, never having lived within the borders of his new town. By the early 1800s, the country was moving west, and for a while it seemed like much of it was passing through tiny Waynesburg. As the main road from Baltimore to Pittsburgh, Main Street, Waynesburg, was constantly torn apart by wagon and stage traffic.
They sort of got a little bit tired of having to repair the roads all the time that were near their property. So the Waynesboro, Greencastle, Mercersburg Turnpike Association was formed, and they started to collect toll at various locations every 3 to 5 miles, so that that money that was collected could be used towards repairing the roads.
Houses were added so toll keepers could make collections 24 hours a day. By 1818, Waynesburg sought to incorporate under Pennsylvania state law. But at the time, there were 3 Pennsylvania towns using the same name. The debate lingered for 12 years. In 1830, the Pennsylvania legislature attempted to settle the issue by changing the name to Waynesboro, spelled B-O-R-O-U-G-H. But that name was taken as well. Finally, in January of 1831, the spelling was changed to B-O-R-O and signed into law. New borough limits were drawn, and the town's first chief burgess and town council were elected. The first ordinance passed April 21, 1832. It forbid the placement of building materials in the streets and alleys for longer than 48 hours. By the mid-1800s, the Industrial Revolution sweeping Europe was slowly making its way to Waynesboro. Small mechanic shops were everywhere. A handful were owned and run by 2 brothers, Peter and Dan Geyser. Peter's designs for grain thrashers and separators were the beginnings of what would become the town's first large-scale manufacturing.
He got his first patent in 1852, at which time he did not have enough capital to make more than 1 or 2 of the separators, and also it took time for them to be accepted. But Daniel, who was the salesman and the entrepreneur, had other businessmen in Waynesboro join with him to actually get the firm started.
Just a few miles away, a talented young man named George Frick was busy developing steam engines in his own shop in Ringgold, Maryland. Business was slow, so in 1857, Frick began to manufacture grain separators under Geyser's patents, and things began to take off. In just a few short years, he outgrew his Ringgold plant and built a new two-story shop on Broad Street in Waynesboro. For now, the Frick-Geyser relationship was a perfect match. Both companies took on more employees, and as business grew, the town grew. The Waynesboro Circulator, the town's first real newspaper, began in 1843, claiming to be neutral in politics, devoted to the fine arts. Its successor, the Village Record, would take over in 1847. The John Bell pottery business was in full gear on Potomac Street. Started in 1833, the Bell family created thousands of unique pieces through the end of the century. Today, Bell pottery is a coveted collector's item. In the 1850s, Waynesboro built its first combination town hall and firehouse right on the diamond. The cost, $599. The first map of Waynesboro was commissioned in 1853. Life was good in tiny Waynesboro, but just over the border, terrible clouds of discontent were becoming ominous. April 12, 1861. Secessionist rebels attacked Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and put into motion the defining event of the century. The news took 4 days to reach Waynesboro, buried on page 2 of the Village Record. Few could fully comprehend what the American Civil War would become. The Mason-Dixon line, just a few miles away, suddenly became a symbolic chasm deeply dividing North and South. And almost overnight, Waynesboro sat perched at the doorstep of the enemy.
The great moral force in the Civil War came from the small towns. Waynesboro started to recruit the first of the 3-month men. The war was only going to last 3 months. They formed the Ladies' Aid Society to support these people going to war, put up 3 flagpoles in the community. And you have to remember, there was no telegraph or no railroad. So communications were slow and reaction would have been slower at that time.
Recruit posters and newspapers bore scareheads, inspiring service and financial assistance. Taverns became news centers. Dozens of men from the area joined up, leaving the simplicity of the farm to take part in what promised to be a noble adventure to save the Union. Little did they know the colossal scope of what was to come. By September of 1862, the war was in full force. After a series of Southern victories, General Robert E. Lee crossed 18,000 Confederate troops into Maryland and headed north. His goal? The Federal Rail Center in Harrisburg. One more victory, he thought, and Europe would be forced to recognize the Confederacy. Waynesboro stood in his path. Meantime, a Union corporal patrolling an abandoned Confederate camp near Frederick discovered a copy of Lee's orders by chance. Now armed with the enemy's plan, General George McClellan ordered his troops north to intercept Lee. They collided on the rolling hills just outside Sharpsburg. Just to the north in Waynesboro, cannon fire could be heard thundering through the valley. For the first time, the ferocity of the war was frighteningly close. Townspeople held a tense vigil and braced for the worst. Robert E. Lee's northern advance was cut short, but at a horrific cost to both armies. The battle at Antietam was the bloodiest day of the entire war.
The casualties, not many came directly through Waynesboro, nor did many of the refugees from Maryland. But when they found out, it was a pretty tragic occurrence, and it brought home to them the closeness of the war, I'm sure of that.
Just 1 month later, the Confederate Army threatened the area again. Lee's best cavalry officer, General Jeb Stuart, staged a daring northern bolt just a few miles west of Waynesboro. His goal? A rail bridge near Scotland and a bit of psychological warfare.
And of course they attempted to burn the bridge at Scotland, but it kind of disappointing because it was iron, they couldn't burn it. And That, the people of Waynesboro were frantic about that because there were outriders, and I think the figure is something like 1,800 horses were gathered from Mercersburg down through Franklin County and on down into this Maryland before they crossed.
Once Stewart was safely back across the Mason-Dixon, the outriders disappeared. By June of 1863, Ulysses Grant held Vicksburg in siege. Determined to break the stalemate, Robert E. Lee planned another northern invasion toward Harrisburg. Once again, Waynesboro stood in his path, and this time there would be no stopping him. Word spread quickly. The rebels were coming.
Mr. Phillips, who was head of one of the banks, he was a little bit upset, so he loaded all of the assets of his bank into a carriage and took it out to roadside in the vicinity of what we now know as the Waynesboro Country Club and buried it.
Carl Besor's grandparents owned a dry goods store on the square.
The family hurriedly moved everything that they could possibly get into the attic to hide it. My father at the time was age 5, and of course he wanted to help. They gave him a few light things to carry up the steps, but he soon became tired, so my grandmother sent him out in the yard to play. Pretty soon she heard this: "Come on, Stonewall Jackson, the goods are in the attic." Needless to say, he was brought back into the house in a jiffy.
On June 23, 1863, hundreds of Confederate troops stormed the town. Waynesboro was taken without a single shot fired. East and west of Waynesboro, Confederates engulfed the valley as their columns pushed northward.
You simply could not march an army of, take a figure of about 70,000 to 80,000. You couldn't march that on one route. It was stretched from Chambersburg to Winchester, so they were using parallel routes.
Lee ordered a unit to stay back, to hold Waynesboro as a possible escape route. While they waited, soldiers began to loot the town. One of the enemy encampments was set up in the fields of the Franz farm.
Oh, this pump handle was in the front yard, and the grandfather said they pumped the well dry from the horses and the men. Got in the cellar down here in the front part of the house, in the brick part, and the guard come in and run them out of there, and one of them left his revolver in there.
Bands of rebels moved from farm to farm, taking animals, grain, anything they could carry. Others moved through the town.
They found the newspaper office and they smashed all of the equipment used to put out the daily paper. In fact, there was no printed news for approximately 6 weeks.
Soldiers also came calling at the Besor's store. Carl's grandmother had barricaded herself inside.
She heard the rifle butts against this wooden door and shouted. First one inside this door gets his head split open with an axe. I often ask my father, do you think she would have done that? He says, yes, I believe she would have.
Just over the mountains, the Union Army caught up with Lee at Gettysburg. A hellacious battle entwined both armies for 4 deadly days. When it was over, Lee was turned back once again. The decisive but costly Union victory at Gettysburg was the turning point of the war. Crippled and on the run, retreating rebel units made their way through or near Waynesboro. Stories tell of the square being jammed, curb to curb with soldiers, horses, and caissons. It said that General Lee himself stopped at the town pump in Center Square to water his horse Traveler. Carl Besor's grandmother and young father may have been eyewitnesses.
She held him up at one of the front windows so he could see him and told him who that gentleman with the white horse was.
One man, George Davis, he walked up to Lee and supposedly said, "Do you remember me? I was in your unit in Mexico during the Mexican War." They shook hands and talked and of course that story was embellished over the years, but basically that did happen. So we're 99% sure that Lee did make a stop here.
Waynesboro was under the Confederate flag for 15 days. Farms, stores, factories, and homes were looted in exchange for worthless Confederate scrip, or nothing at all. Economic losses were huge. On Tuesday, July 7, 1863, at 10 in the morning, the last Confederate soldier left Waynesboro. By 1864, Union attempts to deliver a final blow to the Confederacy had failed. On July 30th, a lone rebel cavalry unit, infamous for terrorizing northern towns, stormed into Chambersburg. General Jubal Early demanded a $500,000 ransom or the town would burn. Unable to pay, Early gave the order, and Chambersburg was set ablaze. More than 500 buildings were lost. Amazingly, no one died. On Palm Sunday, April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered what was left of his army to Ulysses Grant near Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The nightmare of 4 long years of civil war was finally over. Almost immediately, soldiers began breaking ranks and heading home. Waynesboro, like hundreds of towns across the land, rejoiced. For many, the end of the war was a chance for a fresh start. Over the next 50 years, the area's manufacturing might would transform Waynesboro from a farm community to a company town. For George Frick, it would be a difficult journey. The hardship of the war meant selling his grain separator business, plant and all, back to Geyser in 1865. It took him 4 years to rebound with a new plant on the opposite side of Broad Street, where he resumed his steam engine business. By 1873, a depression and failed partnership with a cousin forced Frick to sell off again or fold. 13 local partners came to the rescue, and Frick and Company was formed. George stayed on as superintendent, and 2 years later, introduced a new steam engine called the Eclipse Corliss. Finally, Frick had a breakthrough success. This reliable economical engine drove thrashers, balers, and sawmills, and drove Frick and Company to success. Unable to expand on Broad Street, Frick sold the building to Geyser, purchased land on the west side of town, and in 1881, moved the entire operation to its current location. By 1884, the company incorporated with $1 million capital, expanded their line to include new refrigeration equipment, and became known as simply Frick Company. A powerhouse had emerged. In 1882, a fire dealt Geyser, Price & Company a serious blow. Several buildings were reduced to rubble. They reorganized as Geyser Manufacturing Company, and armed with a new infusion of money, rebuilt, bigger and better than ever. With Geyser on the east side and Frick on the west, jobs were plentiful, and so was competition.
As the companies became organized, they grew apart, and each of them started to get into the other person's business. Frick Company started making separators or thrashing machines, and the Geyser Company brought the two Landis brothers from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, brought them to Waynesboro in 1880 to develop a steam engine line. And that became the famous Peerless steam engine.
The success of Abraham and Frank Landis and their new Geyser Peerless steam engine was enormous. Inundated with orders, Geyser went through a massive expansion. By now, Geyser employees numbered nearly 1,000, thanks in large part to the talents of the Landis brothers. While the Peerless became the heart of Geyser's business, Abe Landis was busy perfecting a new invention, a water-cooled cylindrical grinder that would allow precision engineering for all kinds of new machines. The year was 1888, and the effect was revolutionary. The next year, Abe Landis left Geyser with his patents and opened his own company to develop his new device. The Landis Tool Company had begun.
Although Frick had the initial effect, Geyser had initial effect, but it was the Landises that dumped us into the 20th century, because the products they were making were 20th century products, not 19th.
A new era had begun. Business was booming, The town was booming. From hardware stores to bakeries, by now one could purchase just about anything downtown. The Besor family continued its family tradition as storekeepers on the square. The famous Wolf Block was home to several businesses. A brewery churned out new beer near Burns Hill, and Welty's distillery was busy concocting whiskey. Although in the early days there was a loosely organized volunteer fire department called the Washington Engine Company, the first official fire department, called the Mechanic Steam Fire Engine and Hose Company, was chartered in 1879. Housed in the old town hall on the square, they fought fires with simple hand pumps drawn by horses. In 1880, after a particularly difficult fire, a group of men decided the mechanics needed some help.
So they met on Center Square at the pump and formed a fire company. A gentleman by the name of Cyrus Funk was supposed to have said, "We'll name ourselves the Always There Hook and Ladder Company, so if the mechanics need us, we'll always be there."
The Always There Hook and Ladder Company started with 30 members. Over a century later, both companies continue to work together, providing Waynesboro with critical fire service. In 1881, a new town hall was built on its present site. With its soaring clock tower, the town hall quickly became the symbol of Waynesboro's success. It also housed both fire departments and an auditorium called the Academy of Music, where folks could take in minstrels and concerts. Between 1880 and 1890, the population jumped from 1,800 to 4,000. Massive modernization was taking hold. A telegraph line stretching from coast to coast passed through town, and a new railroad line connecting Waynesboro to critical junctions near Mount Alto made it easier for goods made here to be shipped to the world, and for people to travel long distances with ease. For the first time, water lines for indoor plumbing were installed. A huge natural gas plant was built on the south side to provide fuel for lights, and a newfangled invention called the telephone became available.
By the way, Frick Company got the first phone, and then they put the phones just in the companies, and then eventually it was reported that 25 telephones were put in residence in Waynesboro.
In 1890, macadam was laid on Main Street, from the Diamond east to the Presbyterian Church. And in 1892, electricity immersed the town in exquisite white light. Waynesboro was thriving. As the centennial of 1897 approached, it appeared the first 100 years of John Wallace's grand experiment was a monumental success. In 1897, a Centennial Association composed of the town's most respected leaders set out to plan Waynesboro's 100th birthday. Nothing like it had ever been attempted here before. The centerpiece of the celebration was the Triumph Arch, a huge wooden structure that stood proudly on the east side of the Diamond. Liberally decorated in red, white, and blue, it became the symbol of the centennial. Shops and homes willingly followed suit. When the committee realized they had no suitable gathering place to stage literary and music events, they commissioned a temporary building. Just weeks before the event, the Centennial Music Hall rose on West Main Street. It measured 90 by 150 feet, large enough to hold 2,000 people. The town was ready. At 11 a.m. on September 1st, 1897, several thousand people gathered under blue skies in Burns Hill Cemetery to begin the Centennial's first official event, the dedication of a soldier's monument honoring Civil War dead. For many, the pain of the war was still fresh in their souls. The Honorable Judge John Stewart, President Judge of Franklin County, spoke at the dedication.
This memorial stands in their honor to the memory of those who left these fields, these shops, these offices and homes at their country's call to take their stand in the deadly breach. Few will survive in name and memory beyond the generation who knew them, but who shall dare to put a limit this side, the day of doom itself, the endurance of their work?
Over the next 2 days, there were parades. The Grand Civic Parade, a bicycle parade, the Oddfellows Parade. Floats, sponsored by organizations, merchants, and manufacturers from all over, proudly marched down Main Street. And under the Triumph Arch, as thousands looked on. Concerts and poetry readings in the Centennial Music Hall were playing to full houses. A temporary museum was a huge hit. The most popular feature? A man by the name of Abram Staley. Nearing his 104th year, Mr. Staley was a walking, talking exhibit of the past. The Centennial had been a huge success. One newspaper estimated attendance at over 50,000. The Baltimore Herald duly summed it up.
So Waynesboro celebrated. Its big birthday party took place. The thousands came and saw, and the town did the conquering. Let it be said at the start that no city, no great metropolitan center ever had a better planned and more successful celebration than this town.
The success of the Centennial seemed to linger. The cornet band, the town's oldest, became the Wayne Band. For the next century, the Wayne Band would proudly represent our town at countless parades and concerts.
Well, they appeared at a lot of things, and at times they would play on people's front porches, as I understand it. And I like to think that the band is an integral part of the community.
The Wayne Band is one of a handful of municipal bands remaining in Pennsylvania. As the century came to a close, Mother Nature would have the last word. On February 14, 1899, 26 inches of snow buried the town in just a few hours. As the 1900s began, the talk of the town was the brand new 3-story Wayne building. It was the largest building in Franklin County at the time, outfitted with steam heat and both gas and electric lights. It was cutting edge. Both fire companies moved into a brand new firehouse on Potomac Street that year. The hooks on the right side, the mechanics on the left. Fire remained a constant nemesis. In March of 1900, the popular Wolf Block burst into flames.
The fire erupted into massive, massive flames, and the temperature was 20 degrees, so all the water on the building froze, on the streets. And the next day, they had to tear down the walls because they were leaning so badly. But in a few short days, they decided to build again. And by that fall, they had the new Wolf and McCown building.
In a time of constant change, the most profound rolled into town, literally in 1901. The arrival of the Chambersburg, Greencastle, and Waynesboro Street Railway Company connected nearby towns with easily affordable mass transportation like never before. In Waynesboro, the line extended the entire length of Main Street. For working folks in particular, it meant instant liberation. By 1903, the trolley extended its line east to Penmar Park. 2,000 people paid a nickel each to make the trip the first day alone.
All of a sudden, it grew thousands of people on weekends especially. They wanted to get to the mountains, and the view from Penmar was just astounding on a clear day. You could see probably 50, 60 miles, and that, of course, drew a lot of people to the area.
Established over 25 years earlier on a line of the Western Maryland Railroad, Penmar was a major draw for the Baltimore and Washington social set. Among the first attractions was a dance pavilion and a dining hall. The famous mini train started in 1904 by a Western Maryland engineer who took 3 months' leave each summer to keep them going. There was a Ferris wheel, goat rides. A roller coaster was added in 1909. Penmar Park was a special place to spend an afternoon.
The Sparksburg hotels, and they also had a lot of boarding houses there. My own great-grandmother owned a boarding house there. It was only open in the summertime, and most of the hotels were the same way.
These wonderful hotels with names like the Imperial, the Bon Air, the Edgewood, Blue Mountain House, and Washington Cliff dotted the mountain. But the most spectacular was the Buena Vista Springs Hotel. It was first class, with 300 rooms, the largest on the mountain, catering to the highest of society, from ambassadors to admirals. President Woodrow Wilson was a guest in 1913. Scores of Waynesboro folks came to depend on Penmar for jobs and on the trolley to get them there. The turn of the century was also a turning point for the Landis brothers. In April of 1897, their tool works burned to the ground. They took on investors to survive, and by May, a new plant was going up on its present site on 6th Street. Abe Landis remained in control as superintendent. A few years later, Frank Landis recognized a spin-off opportunity to produce threading equipment for the tool company's cylindrical grinders. In 1903, he created his own separate company, and with the help of new investors and 6 employees, Frank Landis set up shop in a foreclosed plant at Church and 5th Streets. The Landis Machine Company was born, a modest beginning of what eventually would become the largest manufacturer of threading equipment in the world. In 1901, Peter Geiser, the idea man behind many of the Geiser products, died. Brother Dan Geiser, the businessman of the family, had died nearly 20 years earlier. For the first time, the Geiser family had no presence in Geiser manufacturing. By 1912, the company sold out to the conglomerate Emerson Bradingham Company of Rockford, Illinois. The Geiser dynasty was over for good. On the west side, Frick Company's refrigeration business continued to grow. In June of 1910, the company purchased 81 acres of farmland from the Funk family, much of it fronting on West Main Street. That fall, housing lots aimed mainly at Frick employees were put up for sale. Frick even arranged mortgages, and soon that stretch of West Main was aptly named Frick Hill. By 1910, the population had topped 7,000, an increase of 1/3 in just 10 years. The crush of new people forced Waynesboro to upgrade its fledgling school system. The first 2 schools of record had started sometime in the mid-1800s. One of them, known as the Geiser School because it later became part of the Geiser Complex, was probably the first high school. Around 1890, the North Street School was built. In 1902, the 12-room Snyder Avenue School opened, followed 3 years later with an 8-room building on Clayton Avenue. But the real gem of the school system was a brand new senior high school on South Potomac Street at Snyder Avenue. Although the cornerstone said 1910 and 1911, it actually opened in 1912. It was the first to house its own gym, a basement shop, and on the 3rd floor, an auditorium. The cost for the new building, $111,000. The social scene was also changing. Dozens of lodges and social clubs came into being. The new Leland Hotel, the first large-scale hotel of its kind in Waynesboro, offered first-class accommodations and a place to enjoy a fancy meal. Moving pictures came to town in 1907.
The first theater was Dreamland. Within a year, that became known as the It. And it was first located in Center Square and later on moved across the street. When I was a youngster, it became known as the Strand. And that's where you went if you wanted to watch all the cowboy movies and so forth.
The Strand was popular and would enjoy a run of several decades, but it was small, shoehorned into a busy retail block just east of the square. In 1916, a spectacular new theater on West Main Street, called the Arcade, amazed everyone with its soaring ceilings, vast size, and classic style. Its grand stage was immense, home to vaudeville shows, minstrels, and of course, the top silent movies of the day.
My grandfather was manager from 1916 through 1918. My aunt sold the tickets and played the piano. My father showed the pictures. It was a theater, nothing like this on this side of the Mississippi, the biggest stage on this side of the Mississippi, from what I understand. It was a huge place, seated over 1,000 people. The figure we've been seeing is around 1,056.
Had a balcony, and I think a lot of people were courted on the balcony during its day.
On the streets, a new contraption called the automobile was becoming a common sight. In 1908, the Rowe Motor Company made a short-lived go at manufacturing autos in Waynesboro. Their gimmick? Self-starting motors. In 1914, Waynesboro lost its first policeman in the line of duty. Officer William Daywalt was shot and killed while chasing two drunk brothers out of town. No one embodied the rough and tumble turn of the century more than a young barber who fought bare-knuckle brawls for fun. Dutch Schaefer was Waynesboro's first true sports celebrity.
Fought 359 bouts as an amateur and 267 as a professional. He was boxing for 28 years. That's a world record as a professional. Fought 65 bouts in 1 year. That's a world record.
For nearly 7 decades, Dutch was a fixture in town, visiting the hospital each Sunday for almost 60 years, leading a perfect attendance record at his church for 65 years.
He was a very compassionate man, but I think it all went 180 degrees when he got in the ring.
He set the standard as Waynesboro's premier citizen athlete and helped begin our rich tradition as a sports town. Baseball leagues had come and gone since the end of the Civil War. The Alpha Club, considered by many as the town's leading young men's social club, formed a basketball team sporting blue and gold uniforms, colors that may have been the inspiration for the new Waynesboro High School. Sports teams at the high school were slowly becoming organized on their own. But early on, it was the new YMCA that rooted the importance of athletics in this town. Built and dedicated on North Potomac Street in 1915, the people of Waynesboro fought hard to raise the necessary funds the year before. Inspired by the challenge of a traveling evangelist, Dr. William Bitterwolf, and spurred on by a huge contribution by orchard owner D.M. Wirtz, the fundraising project was a huge success.
It was so much of a success that they raised more money than they needed and had $50,000 left over in 1915 when they dedicated that building. And that $50,000 is still in our endowment fund, so it was a great success.
From that moment forward, the Y has been an important touchstone for the community. One of the most memorable days of the era came on June 6, 1917. A terrible storm dropped hailstones the size of apples 3 feet deep. Thousands of windows in homes and factories were damaged. The melting ice washed out road after road and filled the square with 4 feet of water. Perhaps it was an omen of the stormy years to come. In 1917, a terrible war was raging in Europe. For months, President Woodrow Wilson preached isolationism, determined to keep the United States out of it. Eventually, he could wait no longer. On September 20th, 1917, 77 local men, the first of hundreds to serve from the area, boarded a train at the downtown station, bound for boot camp and the unknown of a world war half a world away. 3,000 citizens turned out to send them off. At the time, Milt Garland, a young man from Harrisburg, enlisted in the Navy as a master steam engineer. He's one of the 2 Waynesboro residents who are surviving veterans of World War I.
And they put me on board a ship which was civilian operated, but they were hauling coal for the Navy between Norfolk and Boston.
Several Waynesboro businesses aided the war effort. The biggest, Emerson Brettingham Company, was producing 45 combat wagons a week, 800 tons of steel per month. By 1918, 312 local men and women were in the service. In the middle of it all, a devastating flu epidemic struck the nation. 1918 and 1919 were torturous years for Waynesboro. Thousands would become sick. Hundreds would die. With no hospital in town, the YMCA and the fire hall were used as makeshift infirmaries. Deaths averaged 2 per day. Doc Bridgers, a young traveling doctor from Blue Ridge Summit, came to town frequently to do what he could.
In fact, from October the 1st to October the 16th, 40 people died in Waynesboro, the highest number of deaths ever tabulated in that length of time. And so he went to his pharmacist and had him make up doses. And he carried it with him when he went to make his house calls. And it was so successful that he only lost 1 patient.
On November 11, 1918, World War I ended. In all, 18 local men had given their lives. On November 13th, an armistice parade engulfed the town in celebration.
As you may recall, was supposed to be the war to end wars. Well, I had a brother who had served in Europe. The first thing he said when he got home was, well, anybody that says the war is over don't know what they're talking about. This war is not over, and we'll be in it again.
By 1920, Waynesboro's incredible growth pushed the population to nearly 10,000. Despite Prohibition, things were hopping, and downtown was the place to be. Whether window shopping, people watching, or catching one of the new talkies at the arcade, Saturday night was special.
Main Street on Saturday night between Potomac and Center Square was like a midway, both sides of the street. Shoppers really came to town, and people came to visit, you know. Some people that had cars would bring those cars up on Main Street in the afternoon and park them, walk home and have their dinner, then come back in the evening and sit in the cars and watch the shoppers or visit with people.
Gentlemen could play a game of pool or a few frames of bowling at Knepper's on Main Street. The arcade shops featured Newberry's in 1923 and J.C. Penney in 1925. Doc Gardenauer's radio shop, the Val Briscoe department store, the Unique restaurant, and the Town Camera shop. Dreyfus Clothing Store was a fixture for years. David Happy Wishart bought the Central Hotel on the Diamond and changed its name to the White Swan Tavern. Spurred by the devastating flu epidemic of 1918, Waynesboro built its own 36-bed hospital in the early 20s. Around the same time, the Waynesboro Free Library began with nearly 4,000 volumes. It met in the Trust Company building until 1929, when it moved to the second floor of the town hall. World War I vets could visit their new club, the American Legion. On the west side, a new memorial bridge was dedicated to the soldiers killed in World War I. A few blocks away, Fairview Avenue School was built. It was the only one-story school building in the area. Auto dealerships were becoming more plentiful, but the trolley's popularity was hanging on. Riders had a choice of weekend getaways. Aside from Penmar Park, Cold Spring Park on the line just west of town was also hugely popular. Opened by the trolley company around the turn of the century, it was a beautiful spot of land with a soaring canopy of trees picnic areas, a dance pavilion, and of course, the spring itself. Robert and Anna Barnhart, the grandparents of Cindy Berger Nauer, purchased Cold Spring Park in 1926 for $2,500.
Well, a typical day in the early days might consist of 6 or 8 family reunions. Church picnics were very big, and the Wayne Band was a big performing, drawing element. Skating started in about 1910, and the pavilion at first was a dance pavilion, and then they started skating. Well, when my grandfather purchased the park, he enclosed it so that you could skate 365 days a year. And the big thing was when he switched over from an organist providing the skating music to records.
The famous Cold Spring Park mini train would not come along until the late 1940s. The most tragic day in the trolley's history came on May 22, 1920. General Manager R.D. Sefton was guiding a broken trolley car down the mountain from Penmar when something went wrong. Henry McKelvey's father and 2 uncles were trolley drivers at the time.
When they went for the brakes, there was no. And about that time it started to roll pretty fast. The pole jumped off the wire, and that way you had no way of stopping it. It went down to, ran into the back end of another car that left about 10 minutes early. And my uncle was on the back of that one. My dad was on the back that Sefton was on. Mr. Sefton was killed, and another fellow by the name of Mr. Snyder died later.
As the economy was thriving, Waynesboro was sharing the country's love for the stock market with a twist. Every so often, local stocks were bought and sold, put up for auction right on the street. It was called curbside trading.
Before, the stockholders were just a few local people, and then they started to spread, and the banks were developing, First National, Citizens were developing. They needed to sell some stock.
A man named Adams was the first auctioneer. Les Bond took over in the 30s and became synonymous with curbside trading until it ended in the 1960s. When the stock market crashed on October 29, 1929, it launched a depression that would touch virtually everyone. All across the land, businesses were crippled. Jobs were lost. Hours cut. Even farmers struggled when markets bottomed out. Waynesboro's banks held on. The town held on.
You could go to the Relief and get shoes and all kind of clothing and stuff like that. And the men, of course, helped work with the farmers and picked apples, and this went on for a couple of years. It was real tough on families.
Christmas in the early 30s was tough on just about everyone. People pulled together. There were countless untold stories of neighbor helping neighbor. Even corner grocery stores extended credit to families in need, something rarely done before.
And the people that bought there would pay by the week. They'd bring their little pad to the store, and the grocer would write in his pad and your pad.
In the middle of it all, the Wayne Building, the pride of downtown, burst into flames on a bitterly cold day in January 1930. The blaze, fanned by high winds, ripped through the 3-story building in little time. Water from the fire hoses froze almost immediately, covering walls and streets with a thick blanket of ice. Leroy Maxwell, president of the Wayne Building today, was a Boy Scout in 1930.
All of the scouts, all of the Boy Scouts in Waynesboro, assembled at the Wayne Building in uniform and with their staff, a 6-foot-high pole, to assist in the control of crowds. The building was well ablaze when we got there, and we stayed there until it was over. Immediately, Mr. Oler said that he was willing to rebuild it if any of the tenants of the old building wanted to participate. They'd form a corporation, and they did just that.
The new Wayne Building was built and back in business the next year. A couple of years later, another memorably cold day. March of 1932, one of the worst blizzards on record, knocked out phones and electricity. caused snowdrifts several feet high. That same year, the combination of the Depression and our love affair with the auto spelled the end of the trolleys in Waynesboro. With little fanfare, the streetcars that carried thousands to their jobs, church, to Cold Spring Park and Penmar made their last run. In 1935, the Depression claimed one of the biggest employers in town. Emerson Branningham went bust. Hundreds of men lost their jobs. And for the first time since the Civil War, the mammoth plant complex along 2nd Street fell silent. FDR's New Deal helped Waynesboro hang on. Government building programs like the Public Works Administration offered jobs and helped Waynesboro build for the future. A new high school on East Main Street. Across the street, a new west wing for the hospital. Downtown, a new post office building. Works Progress Administration funds helped pay for improvements at the Waynesboro Municipal Airport on Midvale Road. Taxi strips, runways, and a second hangar were added. By 1937, freight and passenger service was taking off. The state was also building a new road, a turnpike connecting Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Beck and Benedict's hardware store supplied all of the dynamite for the excavation. Through it all, the town managed to have a little fun. Baseball was big. Waynesboro was home to farm teams for the Philadelphia Athletics and the St. Louis Cards. From 1938 to 1941, the Waynesboro Orioles were the big draw. The high school football team was unstoppable. In 1939, they went 9-0, undefeated and untied, allowing only 6 points to be scored by the opponents. Their coach, a young man named Rip Engel, who would go on to become a legendary coach at Penn State. The arcade was still holding its own. Hollywood was in its golden age. A new Acme self-service grocery store on Main Street brought Waynesboro into the supermarket age in 1939. Thanks to Ferdinand Gilbert, the groundskeeper at Green Hill Cemetery, riders traveling along Potomac Street enjoyed a life-size menagerie crafted from privet bushes. From 6th Street to 9th Street, Gilbert's Topiary Zoo helped make an otherwise mundane trip a little more interesting. The 30s also gave way to a homegrown big band of Zell Smith and the Penn Aces. Zell was a regular in Hagerstown, Martinsburg, and Waynesboro's Arcade Theater. Most remember the Penn Aces as a fixture on the stage of Penmar's Dance Hall. Zell's band was also the town's first radio star, signing on one of the first stations in the area, WJEJ.
When he said WJEJ is now on the air, Zell gave the downbeat, boom, the bass horn went and just blew the station off the air. All the needles went brrr. So
Zell was a homespun celebrity for decades. In 1940, as the old E.B. Geyser plant was being dismantled, it burst into flames on a hot August day. Sparked by a welder's torch, the fire was immense. When it was over, all that remained of the main building was the 95-foot smokestack, a familiar downtown landmark for generations. 2 months later, it too would come down.
United States
Like
of America.
Woodrow Wilson before him, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried to keep our country out of a world war. But when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, America's collective resolve was clear. The United States would fight. Like countless cities and towns from coast to coast, young men in Waynesboro signed up for duty like never before. Over the course of the war, our sailors, soldiers, and airmen would serve in every corner of the globe. Watson Stoner served in North Africa, China, India, and Burma. Ken Hess spent 320 days on the front lines as an infantryman in France, North Africa, Italy, Austria, and eventually Germany. Eugene Mon watched his fellow Marines hoist the American flag over Iwo Jima. So did 18-year-old Bill Adams as a sailor from the deck of his ship. William Shoemaker fought his way through the snow and bitter cold at the Battle of the Bulge. So did Artie Winters. Artie is a classic World War II soldier story. He enlisted in 1941, trained at Fort Dix, New Jersey, got married on the base to his sweetheart, Charlotte Bond, 6 hours before being shipped off to Europe. As an infantryman, he would fight his way from France to Germany over the next 3.5 years. Tunnel warfare, house-to-house fighting, major campaigns, Artie lived through a lot. One of his most memorable moments was helping liberate a POW camp.
There were Russians that had been in prison and no feed at all. We had these fellows come running out after we took over the small town, and some of them, their arms were very, very small. They were starved, actually, and they were supposed to be taken out, but the SS troops had moved in and were going to take them out and shoot them the next morning, but we saved them.
As our boys fought along the front lines or helped in countless support roles, back home, World War II permeated every aspect of life like nothing before it. There were mandatory blackouts. Civil Air Patrol stood sentry atop Reservoir Hill, watching for enemy aircraft. There were constant drives to buy war bonds, our factories the most ardent supporters. People tended victory gardens. Scrap metal drives even claimed the tracks of the old trolley lines. And counting ration coupons became a way of life.
Some of the ration products were paper products, canned goods, sugar, gasoline. People had to be very careful, especially those that had to drive any distance to work.
The war machine jolted our factories out of the Depression and into full gear.
Landis tool cylindrical grinders were used in the war effort, and anything that had to do with engines, tank engines, aircraft engines, truck engines. Landis Machine Company's products were primarily used in the munitions area, bombs, shells for the threading and tapping of those.
Over at Frick Company, the foundry was turning out 90-millimeter guns, and Milt Garland, in charge of the company's field installation work, helped the Navy outfit ships with Frick refrigeration units.
A lot of equipment, like on the Missouri, those 4 big battleships, they had 34 Frick units, air conditioning, the ammunition holds. And so I rode the trial runs on most of those ships.
As the war pushed on, battle stories made it home. Willard Rudy wrote about being wounded by a round that ricocheted through his tank. Dwight Hastings, a B-17 bomber pilot, was shot down over Germany after 43 missions. He was captured and survived as a POW in 1944. Charles McCleary was on his way to Okinawa when a Japanese kamikaze slammed into his ship. And Artie Winters has his own chilling stories about the Battle of the Bulge.
And I was sergeant then of the heavy machine guns, and we had embankments. We were living in 4 feet of snow, and one of my friends, in fact, he was one of my corporals that was killed. They shot an 88 right straight at him, took the whole section of his body off. He never knew what hit him.
As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, Artie Winters' toughest battle came at the Remagen Bridge, spanning the Rhine River.
We went from house basement to house basement, and as we did that way, of course they were still throwing, the Germans figured that if we ever crossed the Rhine, well, the war would be pretty well over. But of course it wasn't over, but that was the worst battle. They threw everything in on us the next morning. I never run 440 yards so fast in my life. I think I used to run to 440.
So many loved ones in harm's way, so far from home. For several Waynesboro families, the worst possible news changed their lives forever. Norman Diffenderfer was Betty Devlin's husband in 1944.
My husband was drafted in March of 1944, and he went overseas only in February of 45 and was killed just in March of 45. And he had learned while he was there that his brother Joseph was killed only a month before. And my husband was crossing the Rhine River and was on a night patrol and was lost. And it meant a lot. It changed my life. Your dreams, your plans, but you go on.
Norman and Joseph Diffenderfer were 2 of 77 area men lost during World War II. First in Europe, then in the Pacific, World War II was finally over. Word of VJ Day arrived August 14, 1945.
When all of a sudden the church bells started to ring and the whistles started to blow and people come out of their houses, the war is over.
The night that it was officially announced, Waynesboro was just solid people from Broad Street to what we called then the railroad tracks on the west end of town.
So we went to Penmar. You never saw so many soldiers and jeeps.
Then the next night there was a huge parade that started in downtown, and the high school band and all the fire trucks and anybody who wanted in the parade was in it.
I remember going to the victory parade when the war, I think, ended in August of 45, and I had just a little girl at that time. She was only 2.5, and of course that was the sad part, that he never got to come back to her. And I was happy the war was over for everyone, and of course our loved ones didn't come back, but still, I mean, I was glad for the ones that did come back, and it was honor and a tribute to the ones that were lost.
Wouldn't take $1 million for the experience and knowing that we're still alive, but we wouldn't do it again. And I hope that we don't have to, and our boys don't have to go back to war anymore.
With the war behind them, our boys were anxious to step back into the swing of civilian life, getting back to work, starting families. With shortages gone, people lined up to buy cars, houses, the American dream.
Yeah, everybody wanted a new home or a new car. At that time, you couldn't get an automobile. You couldn't get a new automobile. You had to wait. And they only sold for $800 or $900, but they just weren't around.
The post-war demand for goods kept our factories humming, our stores busy. Down the road, brothers Dwight and John Grove were busy making farm wagons in their Shady Grove garage. Like the Geyser brothers and Landis brothers before them, the Grove brothers were at the beginning of an odyssey that would make them a worldwide manufacturing power. A generation had suffered unfathomable sacrifice through the Depression, a world war, and now was enjoying a rebirth. It was a perfect time for celebration. When Waynesboro's 150th birthday, the sesquicentennial, rolled around in 1947, the town went all out.
We had a lot of fun. There were parades, there were costume competitions, there were game days. It was wall-to-wall people almost every day. When the Whisker Club had their final awards and so forth, you couldn't begin to get near the square. There was a huge parade on Saturday afternoon, and my recollection is that that parade lasted about 3.5 hours.
It seemed as if the whole world turned out, the crowds enormous, matched only by the town's pride. The event was so big, the country even listened in. Tom Brenneman, Waynesboro's son and star of the national radio program Breakfast in Hollywood, brought his radio show to the party. For 5 days, hundreds packed the high school auditorium turned studio. where millions from coast to coast listened and learned about the little Pennsylvania valley town called Waynesboro.
The women dressed in their finest clothes and had the silliest hats on that you could possibly find, because one of the specialties of his program was he awarded a person a prize for the silliest hat every day.
From Tom Brenneman to the parades and costume contest, the Sesquicentennial was the event of the century. In the late 1940s, Waynesboro was a picture postcard example of small-town America. Family was everything. Soapbox derbies on Church Street, scouting, marching bands, countless clubs and sports through the Y and the schools. And in 1947, the formation of the town's very first Little League. It's been a rite of passage in this town for 50 years. George Gottschall was one of the first Little League coaches.
It was very competitive. And I think the people in Waynesboro here that started Little League and was working with Little League did a fine job, because they carried through not only uniforms, but Little League picnics as a year-ending event. I can remember we even took the Little League teams to Baltimore to see the Baltimore teams play, professional teams play.
But baseball wasn't the only game in town. The tradition of football also ran deep. In the late 40s, the Waynesboro Tigers semi-pro team was a phenomenon, a roughneck collection of regular guys who played serious football for fun. Catching a Tigers game at Fairview Field became a major town event. Bob Monk Ringer was one of the original coaches from 1947 to 1951.
They set their own goals, and they set them pretty high, I'll tell you. I mean, they played hard. They weren't dirty. We didn't have a lot of college talent because they weren't available. We just had a lot of guys that were really in top shape condition that came back from being in the service.
The Tigers played teams from Hagerstown, Martinsburg, Harrisburg, Washington, and others, like the Vim, Vigor, and Vitality from Reading. In their first 2 years, the Tigers won a phenomenal 22 straight games. As the decade drew to a close, Waynesboro paused to honor our war heroes, the fulfillment of a soldier's last request. Downey Benedict, stationed in Europe during some of the worst of the fighting, made arrangements for several large contributions to Waynesboro in the event of his death. He was killed 6 months later.
He provided money for all these institutions, and he also left $10,000 earmarked to create a memorial park for those that were killed in World War II.
The great expanse of E.B. Field was rededicated as Memorial Park. In one quiet corner, the Elks Club constructed a mall as a permanent memorial, and with the help of school students and others, 32 trees lining Walnut Street and the promenade were planted as a living reminder of our World War II heroes. Since that day in April 1949, plaques honoring our heroes from all wars have been added to the mall. This park, these names, a lasting tribute. Just as World War II was starting to fade away, the United States began sending soldiers to a new conflict thousands of miles away in a place called Korea. Communism was the new enemy. Reserve units like Waynesboro's National Guard Battery C were called up. The draft was reinstated. And while much of the country looked away, indifferent or uninvolved, the battles were no less real for those doing the fighting. Paul Summers knows. He and his brother were Marines stationed in Korea.
We were moving towards Seoul, the capital, and our platoon got in a firefight in a village. But I sprayed the whole area, and when I did, all hell broke loose. There's bullets flying everywhere. And what had happened, the bullet really stayed in me. Hit me in the right shoulder as I was going down, went down my back and lodged in my back and never came out there. I may have killed some. I don't really know. I'm glad I don't know. But then later I went back and rejoined my outfit.
And we got up into North Korea and got surrounded up to Chosin Reservoir of the Chinese. That was a real bad part because it was minus 30-degree temperatures up there. We were laying out on the ground in sleeping bags and a foot or two of snow. And it was really bad. They hit us that night. I noticed there was dead Chinese laying all around us, 4 and 5 on a pallet. There was, man, it must have been hundreds of them laying all around. I've heard a lot of people say the bottom line is that we didn't win the war in Korea. They got to realize that the 38th parallel was a dividing point, and the communist forces came down over that dividing point. Where are they today? They're not down over that 38th parallel. So as far as I'm concerned, it was a victory for the United Nations. But there's an awful lot of boys killed on both sides. I feel sorry for the Chinese, too.
20 local men gave their lives in Korea. As the 50s wore on, we entered a special time, an innocent age, with one foot firmly planted in the traditions of the past, another hurtling toward the promise of the space age. The economy was strong. Everything seemed plentiful and cheap. The job market was solid. Landis Machine boasted a new office building. Grove Manufacturing was booming, with annual sales nearing $1 million. A municipal golf course was proposed. The town's first radio station, WAYZ, hit the air. Despite it all, the 50s really belonged to the kids. Sock hops, ducktails, greasers, saddle shoes, poodle dresses, cars, and that loud new music they call rock and roll. It was a carefree time. Kids downtown could swing into Funk's drugstore for a Coca-Cola and marshmallow, or the new teen center called Uncle Dudley's.
We had a luncheonette in front. We had a 30-foot dance floor in the back. We had a Nickelodeon. It was great.
For those lucky enough to have a car or a ride, the strip east of town was the place to be. In the early 50s, a burger and fries joint called The Varsity on the Sunshine Trail was the hangout. But by the mid-50s, the younger crowd staked out their own claim just a few doors down. The Big Dipper started out as an ice cream and burger shop and evolved into the second home for a whole generation. Hundreds of kids would jam the place on Friday or Saturday night. Anyone who was there will tell you the secret wasn't the good food, the fantastic jukebox, or the car hops. It was the owners, Dick and Mary Jane Boyer.
It was strictly a big, happy family. We were part of them. We mingled with them constantly. First of all, we did sell good food, but sometimes 5 of them would buy one order of French fries and divide it up, and that wasn't very profitable. We weren't really in it for the money, I don't think. I think we just enjoyed doing what we were doing.
It was great. I went there, from about 13, 14 until I graduated, and it was just the place to go. They cared about the kids. They watched us. They raised us.
Most of them were brought out by their folks in station wagon loads. Dropped off, and about 10 or 10:30, they'd be back to pick them up.
After football games, basketball games, I used to say, "Come on in, Dave, just come in, see what's going on." So we'd go to high school. I'd go to high school. And heck, if I was late getting out of the stadium or getting out of the gym, I couldn't get in the place because there were so many kids there.
I was there one night after a football game. She was a majorette, and she came in, and I saw this cute little girl dancing back there. And we just got to know each other. We were married 40 years this summer.
I did this and I did that. I met my wife here and this and that, you know. Wherever we go, we hear that.
Had the biggest family anybody I know.
Was Charlie your classmate? Oh, no kidding.
The Big Dipper was a symbol of the best the 50s had to offer. Innocent and carefree fun served up with a healthy helping of family values, where memories, friendships, and courtships were made to last a lifetime.
It was for the kids. I mean, that's what we really had it for.
Like I say, we didn't make much money, but we still had a lot of fun. Isn't that right?
You bet.
By the 60s and 70s, times were changing quickly. Waynesboro was losing parts of its past. In 1966, the arcade, now antiquated and in disrepair, was torn down. Waynesboro was also coping with the changes in America's idealism, the generation gap, civil rights, women's liberation, assassinations. It was a difficult time. So when the United States entered Vietnam, it became a lightning rod for dissenting opinion. It was a confusing time for men like Dick Avey, who served proudly as a Marine half a world away, to return to an ungrateful homecoming.
I was a machine gunner on a Navy gunship. I had a personal experience happen to me at the bus terminal in Washington, D.C. when I was changing buses to come to Hagerstown, Maryland. And a woman walked up to me and asked me how many women and kids that I had killed. And it was just like she had taken her fist and slammed me right in the stomach with it. And before I got a chance to walk away from her, she spit in my face. So that was kind of like my welcome home from Vietnam. And you know, there's a lot of stories similar to that. I had a lot of animosity towards people, the way we were treated. And I guess some of the healing process was I went through some personal therapy, and also I got involved working with Vietnams for about 11 or 12 years, and that was kind of a healing process for me.
For many vets, the Vietnam War will never really end.
And being involved with Vietnam veterans, one of the people some of the people that I don't want to forget is the people that was left behind, either prisoners of wars and MIAs. So, you know, they're still special in my heart.
Back home, the 60s and 70s brought revolutionary changes to the core of Waynesboro's school system. A new modern high school was opened in 1962. The old senior high on Main Street became East Junior High. In 1971, Antietam Junior High and Summit View Elementary were opened nearby. And Old West Junior High, what had been the state-of-the-art high school of 1912, the touchstone through 2 world wars and the Depression, would become a victim of the wrecking ball. Clayton Avenue, North Street, and Snyder Avenue schools were also taken out of service. In 1974, the Fairview Avenue Elementary School was destroyed by an enormous fire. A new school would be built in its place. With 4 new schools in less than 15 years, Waynesboro had a state-of-the-art system. Over the last few decades, Waynesboro modernized in other ways. Despite delays and a rough start, Northside Pool opened in 1972. The new YMCA opened in 1975. The original building that served us so well was retired. The hospital went through 2 major renovations. For a time starting in the late 70s, new outlet stores that gave new life to the old Geyser properties brought shoppers to Waynesboro from miles around. The advent of mini malls made it tough for downtown merchants. There have been accolades and accomplishments. In 1976, longtime beloved music teacher Robert Raz Zimmerman helped prepare the Bicentennial musical celebration for 30,000 schools and colleges. In 1985, East Junior High was honored at the White House by Education Secretary William Bennett as one of just 277 schools from across the country deemed models of the nation. Frick made it to several Olympics, including the 1988 Calgary Winter Games, as a provider of refrigeration equipment for the luge track. Along the way, there have also been tragedies. An arsonist caused almost $4 million in damage to the Frick factory. And in 1994, a small plane tragically fell from the sky and crashed into a home on South Potomac Street. Michael and Kay Pearsall and 2 people on the plane were killed. Waynesboro has learned to embrace its history. Formed after World War II, the Waynesboro Historical Society has helped preserve important pieces of our past. Burns Cabin, Welty's Bridge, Harbaugh Church, the Oler House. The jewel of Waynesboro's historical properties is Renfrew Museum and Park. Given as a gift by the Nicodemus family in 1973, Renfrew Museum and Park opened in 1975. and has since become the focal point for hands-on historical and environmental education for our area.
Mrs. Nicodemus was a visionary. She's seen in this property things that the average person would not have seen. She cherished this place, she loved this, she was a very private person. I think if Mrs. Nicodemus could come back and see it today, she would say, well done. I really believe that.
Over 53,000 visitors have enjoyed Renfrew Museum and Park in the past 10 years. History is all around us. These familiar streets and buildings have stood witness to so much for so long. Through our 200 years, many things at its heart have remained unchanged. Farming continues as an important part of life here. Rolling fields of green surround this town in every direction. And our major industries, now competing globally in a high-tech, computer-driven world, remain the foundation of our local economy. This year, the Landis Tool Company is celebrating its 100th year. Other businesses, fixtures here for so long, are also celebrating anniversaries. The Record Herald is 150 years old. Savage Minnick Pharmacy and Waynesboro Hospital are 75 years old. And Grove Manufacturing and the Fish and Game Association are 50 years old. Waynesboro has prided itself as a classic American small town. Life here takes on its own pace, where family comes first, where generations have willingly answered its country's call in times of need, where people are quick to lend a helping hand.
The dedication, the loyalty, and the concern that people have for the community. And the volunteers. Waynesboro has a tremendous volunteer program. There are volunteers working all the time. And those people have given a great deal to the community and continue. Waynesboro is proud of its past, secure in its future, and eager for challenges of the 21st century.
The future, the next 200 years, lies in the hands of our most cherished asset, our children, to continue the spirit and pride of Waynesboro for generations to come.
God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans, white with